The rain fell in torrents across the New Mexico territory, turning the dusty trails into rivers of mud and transforming the normally clear desert air into a gray curtain of water. Sheriff James Cordell had been riding for hours, tracking a group of outlaws who had robbed the bank in Silver Creek 3 days prior. His horse moved slowly through the downpour, its head lowered against the relentless rain, while James pulled his coat tighter and squinted through the storm, looking for any sign of shelter or the men he pursued. At 52 years old, James had been wearing the sheriff's badge for nearly 20 years. He had seen the territory change from wild frontier to something approaching civilization, though that transition had been neither smooth nor kind to everyone involved. He had witnessed injustices that haunted his sleep, had made decisions that weighed on his conscience, and had learned that the law, as written in books back east, often looked very different when applied to the harsh realities of the West. His face bore the weathered lines of a man who had spent decades under the desert sun, and his gray-streaked beard and the slight stoop to his shoulders spoke of the toll those years had taken. The abandoned trading post appeared suddenly through the rain, a sagging structure of weathered wood that looked ready to collapse but offered at least the promise of temporary shelter. James guided his horse toward it, dismounting with a groan as his joints protested the hours in the saddle and the penetrating cold of the rain. He led his horse under what remained of an overhang and was about to push through the broken door when he heard it, a sound that made him freeze, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. It was crying. Not the wailing of someone in immediate danger, but the deep, broken sobs of someone who had reached the absolute end of their endurance, someone who had nothing left. James pushed through the door carefully, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. In the corner of the main room, huddled against the wall beneath a section of roof that still held, sat a young woman. Even in the poor light, James could see she was Apache, perhaps 25 years old, with long black hair plastered to her face and shoulders by the rain. Her traditional dress, beautifully crafted with intricate beadwork, was torn and muddy. Her feet were bare and bleeding, her face bruised, and her arms wrapped protectively around herself as she shook with cold and emotion. James had seen many terrible things in his years as a lawman, but something about this scene struck him particularly hard. The woman looked up at his entrance, and the terror that flashed across her face made him stop immediately. She pressed herself harder against the wall, her dark eyes wide with fear, and he realized that whatever had happened to her, whoever had hurt her, she expected him to do the same or worse. His badge, his gun, his very presence represented authority, and authority had clearly not been kind to her. Slowly, very slowly, James holstered his revolver and held up both hands to show they were empty. He took a step back toward the door, giving her space, and in the calmest voice he could manage over the sound of the rain hammering on what remained of the roof, he said simply, "You're safe now." The woman stared at him, her breathing rapid and shallow, clearly trying to decide whether to believe him or whether this was some new trick, some fresh cruelty. James stayed perfectly still, letting her study him, letting her make the decision. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a minute or two, she seemed to relax slightly, though she remained pressed against the wall. James very carefully removed his coat, moving slowly so as not to startle her, and held it out at arm's length, then laid it on the floor between them before backing away again. "You're cold," he said quietly. "And you're hurt. I'm not going to harm you. I give you my word." He knew his word might mean nothing to her, that she had likely heard promises from white men before, promises that had been broken as easily as they were made. But it was all he had to offer in this moment besides the coat and his willingness to keep his distance. The woman looked at the coat, then back at him, then at the coat again. Finally, with movements that spoke of both desperation and lingering fear, she reached forward and pulled it toward herself, wrapping it around her shoulders. The coat, still warm from James's body heat, seemed to provide some comfort. She stopped shaking quite so violently, though the tears continued to stream down her face, mixing with the rainwater that dripped from her hair. James slowly lowered himself to sit on the floor, deliberately making himself less imposing by sitting rather than standing. He kept his distance, staying near the door while she remained in her corner. "My name is James Cordell," he said. "I'm the sheriff from Silver Creek. I was tracking some bank robbers when the storm hit." He paused, then added, "I'm going to reach into my saddlebag for some food and water. I'm not reaching for my gun. Do you understand?" The woman didn't respond verbally, but she watched his every movement as he carefully retrieved a canteen and some dried meat wrapped in cloth. He placed them on the floor and slid them gently toward her, the same way he had done with the coat. She looked at the offerings with an expression that mixed hunger with suspicion, but after a moment, she grabbed the canteen and drank deeply, water running down her chin in her desperation. Then she tore into the dried meat with a hunger that told James she hadn't eaten in days. As she ate, James studied her more carefully, his lawman's eye noting the details. The bruises on her face and arms were in various stages of healing, suggesting sustained abuse over time rather than a single incident. The tears in her dress appeared deliberate, as if someone had grabbed and ripped the fabric. Her feet were badly cut, with some wounds fresh and others partially healed, indicating she had been running for several days. Most telling were her eyes, which held a particular kind of trauma that James had seen before in victims of the worst kinds of violence. "What happened to you?" he asked gently. The woman looked at him but said nothing. James wasn't sure if she didn't speak English or simply chose not to answer. He tried again, speaking slowly. "Who hurt you? Were you at a reservation? Did you run away?" Still no response, but something flickered in her eyes at the mention of a reservation. The rain continued to pound outside, and as the initial shock of finding shelter began to wear off, James realized they would likely be stuck here for some time. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and traveling in this weather, especially with someone in her condition, would be dangerous. He began to gather some of the drier pieces of wood scattered around the abandoned trading post, building a small fire in what had once been a fireplace. The woman watched his every move, flinching slightly when he struck the match but relaxing as the fire began to grow and warmth started to fill the small space. As the hours passed and the storm raged outside, the woman slowly began to relax. The warmth of the fire, the food in her stomach, and James's consistent maintenance of distance and non-threatening behavior gradually convinced her that his promise of safety might actually be genuine. She pulled the coat tighter around herself and, for the first time since he had found her, met his eyes directly rather than watching him with the wary gaze of a hunted animal. "Kiona," she said suddenly, her voice hoarse from crying and disuse. It took James a moment to realize she was telling him her name. He nodded slowly. "Kiona," he repeated, trying to pronounce it correctly. "That's a beautiful name." She studied him for another long moment, then in halting English, began to speak. Her story emerged slowly, in fragments interspersed with long silences. She had been living on the reservation with her family, trying to survive under conditions that James knew were often deplorable. The Indian agents who were supposed to protect and provide for the Apache people were corrupt, selling the supplies meant for the tribe and pocketing the money. The people were starving, disease was rampant, and complaints were ignored or met with violence. Kiona's father had spoken out about the conditions, had demanded that someone investigate the theft and corruption. 2 weeks later, he had been found dead. His death ruled an accident, though everyone knew better. The agent who ran the reservation, a man named Cyrus Blake, had decided that Kiona would become his, treating her as property to be claimed. When she refused, when she fought back, he had beaten her and kept her locked in a storage room behind his office. For 3 weeks, she endured horrors that she could barely speak of, her voice breaking as she tried to explain. Then, 5 nights ago, during another storm, she had managed to escape through a small window, running barefoot into the desert with nothing but her torn dress and the desperate hope that death in the wilderness would be better than what awaited her if she stayed. As James listened to her story, a cold rage built inside him, the kind of anger that was all the more powerful for being controlled and focused. He had suspected that things on some of the reservations were bad, had heard rumors of corruption and abuse, but hearing it directly from a victim, seeing the physical evidence of that abuse in the bruises and cuts that covered her body, made it real in a way that rumors never could. Cyrus Blake. He knew the name, had met the man once or twice at official functions. Blake had seemed like so many of the Indian agents, ambitious, politically connected, and utterly indifferent to the people he was supposed to serve. "You're safe now," James repeated, and this time the words carried a weight of commitment that went beyond simple comfort. "I promise you, Kiona, you're safe. Blake will never touch you again." Kiona looked at him with eyes that wanted desperately to believe, but had been hurt too many times to trust easily. "You promise," she whispered. "Men with badges promised before. They lied." James met her gaze steadily. "I know," he said. I know that men who should have protected you failed you. I know you have no reason to trust me. But I'm giving you my word, and where I come from, a man's word is everything. You're under my protection now, and anyone who wants to hurt you will have to go through me first." The storm finally began to break as dawn approached, the rain lessening to a drizzle and then stopping altogether. James had stayed awake through the night, keeping the fire going and maintaining his respectful distance while Kiona finally slept, exhausted by her ordeal and perhaps, for the first time in weeks, feeling something approaching safety. When she woke, he had water heating for coffee and had found some hardtack in his saddlebag that, while not appetizing, was at least nourishment. They set out together as the sun rose, painting the wet desert in shades of pink and gold. James had given Kiona his bedroll to wrap around herself for additional warmth and had fashioned makeshift protection for her wounded feet from pieces of his spare shirt. She rode his horse while he walked beside it, leading them not toward the reservation she had fled from, but toward Silver Creek and whatever protection he could provide there. The journey took 2 days, and during that time, James began to formulate a plan. He couldn't just hide Kiona away and hope Blake would forget about her. The man had resources, connections, and the backing of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But James had something too. Evidence, in the form of a traumatized victim willing to testify, and contacts of his own built over 20 years of law enforcement. More importantly, he had something that Blake lacked: actual honor and the willingness to risk everything to do what was right. When they arrived in Silver Creek, the town buzzed with curiosity about the sheriff returning with an Apache woman. James ignored the whispers and stares, taking Kiona directly to the local doctor, a kind man named Samuel Hart who had long been troubled by stories from the reservations. Dr. Hart examined Kiona's injuries, documenting each one carefully, his face growing grimmer as the extent of her trauma became clear. He provided treatment, proper clothing, and a quiet room where she could rest, all without asking questions that James could tell he had. Over the next weeks, James worked tirelessly. He sent telegrams to contacts in the territorial government and even to officials in Washington. He documented Kiona's testimony in careful detail. He investigated Blake's financial records, discovering the paper trail of theft and corruption that agents at the reservation had either ignored or been complicit in. He gathered testimonies from others who had suffered under Blake's authority, traveling to speak with Apache families who had been too afraid to speak out before, but who found courage when they learned that someone with authority was actually willing to listen. Kiona stayed under James's protection, living in a room above the general store owned by a widow woman named Martha Chen who had a reputation for kindness and discretion. Slowly, with proper food, medical care, and the absence of fear, Kiona began to heal, physically and emotionally. She helped Martha in the store, learning more English and teaching Martha some Apache words in return. The two women developed a friendship that transcended their different backgrounds, united by their mutual experience of loss and their gradual building of new lives. James found himself stopping by the store more often than was strictly necessary to check on Kiona's welfare. He told himself it was his duty to ensure she remained safe, but there was more to it than that. In Kiona, he saw a strength and resilience that commanded respect. Despite everything she had endured, she had not been broken. She still smiled, still found reasons to laugh, still showed kindness to others. She asked about his work, his life, and listened with genuine interest to his stories. They began taking walks together in the evenings, proper and chaperoned by Martha, but walks nonetheless where they talked about everything and nothing, finding common ground in unexpected places. The reckoning with Cyrus Blake came 3 months after James had found Kiona in that abandoned trading post. Armed with evidence that even Blake's political connections couldn't ignore, federal marshals arrived to arrest him. Blake tried to run, tried to use his influence to make the charges disappear, but the case was too solid and too public. He was eventually sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison, and the investigation he sparked led to the removal of several other corrupt agents and, eventually, to reforms in how reservations were administered. For James and Kiona, Blake's conviction marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Kiona no longer had to look over her shoulder in fear. She could begin to truly heal, to think about what kind of life she wanted to build now that survival was no longer her only concern. James, for his part, found that his own life had been transformed by keeping the promise he had made in that storm. He had told Kiona she was safe, and in ensuring that safety, in fighting for justice on her behalf, he had rediscovered a sense of purpose that had been fading under the weight of years and compromise. One evening, as they walked together under a sky full of stars, Kiona stopped and turned to James. "You kept your promise," she said simply. "When you found me crying in the rain, you said I was safe. I didn't believe you then, but I do now." James looked at this remarkable woman who had survived so much and had somehow retained her humanity and her hope. "You were always safe with me," he replied. "From that first moment, you were under my protection. That hasn't changed, and it never will." Their relationship evolved slowly, with the patience of two people who had both known loss and who understood that trust, once broken, must be rebuilt with care. The town gradually accepted Kiona's presence, won over by her quiet dignity and her willingness to help others despite what had been done to her. James and Kiona eventually married, in a quiet ceremony that combined elements of both their traditions, creating something new from two different worlds. James continued as sheriff, but he became known as a man who would actually listen to complaints from the Apache people, who would investigate crimes committed against them with the same diligence he showed for crimes against white settlers. Kiona worked with Martha to establish a small school where Apache children could learn English while also maintaining their own language and traditions, a bridge between cultures that she was uniquely positioned to build. Years later, when people asked James about the most important case of his career, he never mentioned the famous outlaws he had caught or the major crimes he had solved. He always spoke of a storm, an abandoned trading post, and a woman crying in the rain whom he had promised to keep safe. That promise, kept against considerable obstacles, had transformed not just Kiona's life but his own, proving that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply show up when someone needs help and follow through on a simple declaration, "You're safe now."